Well, thank you, Brandon, for the introduction. He didn't include that I really like to do karaoke, and I did put that in my preferences. So tomorrow, we're doing it. OK, so thank you all for coming to this talk. Have a very ominous title because, clickbait and marketing, and I have that background. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about all these conversations we're having in developer relations right now. Really all of it really comes back down to executive buy-in. And if we don't have executive buy-in before anything else, talking about what backpack we should wear or what we should do for initiatives or what sticker is the best really is a moot point. So let's dig into that a little bit. Also, my clicker isn't working, so I'm going to hang out by the stage a little bit. So there's 3 types of executives. We have the first one, they get it. They're on your page. They have a clear plan. There's no question on budget or initiatives. They're all in. The next one you have is the middle ground. So they're like, oh, yeah, I understand developer relations. I think that's a cool thing. I've heard it. And they're bought in. And I do quotes, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But they're not quite sure how to maybe measure or execute. And then you have the last one, and they have no clue. And that one, maybe they're still questioning budget. They're not quite sure what they need. And you may not even, you say DevRel, and they're like, yeah, no, I don't need to talk about that. So each one, let's talk about, so they get it, right? And how do you maintain, so when you have an executive that understands developer relations, how do you maintain that? Because yes, they're bought in, but it doesn't mean they're always going to be bought in. And how you can maintain it is communication and kind of doing internal evangelism. And so a lot of times we're going out and we're speaking at events and we're doing our thing, and we forget that inside we actually have to talk about that within our organization and let them know what we're doing to make sure there's no single point of failure. Another thing you can do, if you already have an established developer relations team and program and your executives all set, maybe create a roadbook for your future advocates so they know when they come in, day one, what to get going and hit the ground running. Another one, doing developer relations onboarding. Not only having a roadbook, but an onboarding book. What does it mean to be a developer advocate at your specific company? Because that looks different at a lot of different companies we're at. And routine reporting. So you've got the executive bought in. They're like, yep, let's do it. How do you show them what you're working on? And not just occasionally at the year kind of scrambling in like, hey, it's December 28th. We know at the budget, what did developer relations do this year? But quarterly basis, monthly, maybe ongoing if you have those kind of resources. We're going to skip right to the no clue one. So they're still trying to work on budget. They really don't have everything all set, and you're still having lots of discussions or arguments. My personal opinion, also, these do not, my opinions only, don't represent any employer. You should look for another job. Because ultimately, you're going to be fighting an uphill battle. And if your executive doesn't have that buy-in, there's not a lot of point for anything else. Middle ground. I'm going to be honest, this is going to be the majority of the talk, because I feel like this is where a lot of developer relations departments and teams are right now. The executive is there. They've heard of it. They're like, yep, that sounds great. How do we measure and execute? I'm not quite sure. And you've got this kind of in-between space. And this is really hard, because you ask the very first question, like, hey, you're hiring for DevRel. Great. And I want to go be like the head of their DevRel program. But maybe they don't quite understand what developer relations is, and more so, maybe they don't understand developer relations at their specific company. So from here, when you're at this middle ground, the important thing is you want to ask more questions. And let's make a clear path to align company values with yours. So when you're asking them, what's the most important thing to your company? And see how that lines up with your values as a developer relations program. And discussing what does success factors look like for that department, communication, teamwork, and ultimately, some strategy questions. So let's get into a couple questions that you can ask your department and your executives. I broke these into 4 categories, and so we can go through each one of them. And also have these slides posted on online afterwards if you want to look at them. So overall value. Ask your executive, like, why do you think developer relations is important? And what value do you think it brings? And what are you looking to get out of DevRel? These are all great questions to ask your executive and see what they say. And I recommend ask a question and then stay silent. Don't give them any leading ones and just see what they're doing and what's their first gut reaction. Also, I'm going to go through each answer. It's totally OK for all these answers to be like, I don't know. And there you go back to maybe it's time for another job search. So some answers to be wary about for that one is like, hey, we saw Twilio doing it, and they were great. So we should do that. We saw Stripe doing it. Insert company name here, really. But look at some of the successful programs that we've seen for developer relations, and a lot of companies will be like, oh, they did it, so we should do it. And that doesn't always work. So if you have that question, or whatever that looks like, they saw another company doing it, but that's the only reason they have, that's a warning sign. So let's talk about success factors. When you're looking at developer relations, obviously you want your program to be successful. And what does that look like? And what does that look like not only for your department, but also for your company and in the executive's eyes? So you can ask them, what does a successful DevRel person or team look like? You may be that very first person coming on as your DevRel team. And so maybe your team of 1, which is totally reasonable for a startup. Or maybe you're coming into an existing team, or they're like, hey, I want to build out 20 people for this team. And you say, great, what does that look like to you? If you said, this is my perfect idea of a DevRel program, how do I look at that? Another one, how are you measuring things? And not just in developer relations, but for the whole company. How are they measuring success for engineering, for marketing, for sales? What's the health grade for the company overall? And this is really important because then you can look at that and how does that line up with your program. And I think this is a key thing too, is what does success look like to the board? And so beyond the executives, but the next level up, the board, when they're having those big board meetings, what does the developer relations success look like? Is it something, do they even know about it? Are they say yes, if sales are up, then developer relations is doing well. Or if I saw someone do a viral tweet, so therefore developer relations is doing well. All these things you don't know about until you ask. Some answers to be wary about. We aren't measuring anything. Or our board isn't aware of our initiatives. And those initiatives I'm talking about specifically for developer relations. Maybe your board has no clue what the DevRel program does. And again, not necessarily a bad thing, warning sign. So teamwork. How are responsibilities divided? And this is not just within developer relations, but how is that divided amongst the whole company? What does marketing do? What does sales do? What does biz dev? Do you even have a biz dev? Do you have a customer success team? Do you have an education team? This really all changes in scale from companies from 0 to 50, 50 onwards, and that can look different at one 50-person company versus another, or even a 1,000-person company. I think this is really important because the teamwork and how things are broken out, just because you have a Series A startup that doesn't have a lot of money, they can have a really successful DevRel program compared to a public company that has thousands of employees, and they may not know what we're doing. And I think often we often looked at, well, if they make this much money or they're public, that means obviously they know what they're doing, which is wrong in a lot of cases. And so for that one, how is the goal distributed? What's each team, what do they bring to the table? And how is that viewed? So what is the marketing department responsible for, or engineering? And are stakeholders' goals being represented around the team? So when you're looking at that for the board or for the executive, those stakeholders are there in their team. What goals are associated with them? And how are those goals then represented in your team? And how are they being found? I feel like you see that a lot, and they're like, oh, well, DevRel, it's a feedback loop. Everything's great, which is cool, But there's a lot of other departments that have developed like feedback as part of their #1 thing. So that can't be the only thing developer relations is for. I saw someone tweet, it's like yesterday, the day before, I don't know. Time's a thing right now because of jet lag. But they were saying, they did like a quote tweet, like, hey, if your job as developer relations is only feedback loop, then you probably shouldn't have it. Like, I shouldn't have a job. And I think that's something that's really important because, yes, it's part of our job, and that's something that we can help be a part of, like that feedback loop in the community, but that's not the only thing. So if you have an executive that really thinks the only thing you're supposed to do is feedback loop, I'd question that one. OK, so communication. How do you currently communicate? Is that all in Slack? Is there an all hands? Are there like newsletters that go internally, externally? Is it all in a forum? This is really important because then you can see how they communicate within departments and then how you can communicate as a developer relations department. And how is communication handled? Oh, I just covered that, the one. So again, between other departments. So between marketing and engineering, is there any kind of crossover? Does one person sit in another meeting? Is it really just high-level notes? And then how do we get feedback from that team? So that's the really important thing, too, is so, hey, like you're doing all these initiatives, and engineering is pushing out all these drivers. Like, how do you get feedback to that team, and then also from that team on how you're doing? This one, too, like, so ask people, like, oh, hey, for the developer relations, how do you know things are going well? Or, like, how do you communicate? Like, oh, I see some Slack updates. I see them tweet a lot. I know that they're never in the office. Not great insights to your developer relations team. OK, so now that we've asked a couple questions, really, the key here is that you need to understand your value to the executive team. And then you need to use that to measure against their priorities. And then with the one, I just want to define executive buy-in, because I think that looks different for a lot of places, and really for maybe everybody in the audience, so we're on the same page. And for this purposes of this talk, executive buy-in is an executive that understands your goals at a high level and advocates for you. Not only just defends you, but advocates for you and says, yes, I understand what this person is doing, and this team, here's the value they bring in, and I am behind it 100%. So I want to talk about like what executive alignment looks like. And then these are executives that are some of the companies that win. So Anil Dash, he's at Glitch. Jeff Lawson at Twilio/SendGrid. And David Singleton at Stripe. And these are all executives that really truly believe in developer relations. And I think that Jeff's talked to about a lot because we see that, I mean, Twilio is used as our like sweetheart example in a lot of conferences here. So I want to focus on Anil. And Anil, I think, is someone that came on to the scene, and he's well known in technology, but I feel like he really made a big splash on advocating, saying, like, I not only believe in developers, I believe in developer relations. He was on stage here, actually, London, different location, 2 years ago. And that's right after he had run like these 10 commandments on developer relations, which is really interesting because he was coming and taking a stand and putting his whole backing of his power as an executive and as a leader in the community about saying what I believe in developer relations and what does that mean to me and then the company. And really, ultimately, it comes back to developers driving decisions. And that's what our whole department and whole team should be about, is developer relations should be out there and helping developers drive a decision to that product. So, quick story time. So we're talking about like all these kind of theoretical things. This is the questions you should ask. And also, a lot of those questions I put up there, I ask in my interviews now. And anytime I'm talking with companies about what are they doing in developer relations, because it really helps me understand what's happening before I even get there, or when I get there. But it's not always been the case. So I've been at a company before where I walked in and I was like, oh, this is a successful developer relations program. I'm joining. I'm super excited. We had a team that was like growing. We had headcount. And we came in and it didn't quite know what we were working on, but I was like, it's OK, we'll work it out. We'll figure it out later. Well, we figured it out. But the team actually ended up ultimately going down to 1. So we failed. And so in the executives' eyes, they're like, well, why should we have developer relations? I don't understand, like, what's the value of it? And on that, actually, we switched teams. So we went from marketing to engineering, and then to, like, we don't quite know, you're just kind of, like, there. And so when we were in that there point, it was this big fight of saying, like, well, what is the value for developer relations? And so I think this was actually a really good thing for me in my career, because then I got to learn, how do I talk with executives, and how do I fully understand what they need? So I asked all the things, like, what does buy-in look like to you? What's important to you? And through that exercise, digging into like what we found out that what was important to them was drivers and those language drivers. And those things, that was important to the executives. They wanted to see more adoption from developers on these different drivers. They didn't really care about how many conferences I was speaking at. They wanted to know, like, hey, I want to see adoption go up. I want to see more information about this language on these different forums. And so ultimately, we then changed and pivoted and created a whole program around developer relations and what that would look like to align with their goals. So with that one, that's where I kind of learned like some of my next steps here. So how do you get executive buy-in? You're in that kind of middle step, and this is a tough place when people are like, I believe in developer relations, but I'm not quite sure how to measure and execute it. You've got a road in front of you. It's a little bit of hopscotch. You might not go straight. You might be going back and forth, but you have a path. And it may not always be clear. And that one, this is where I think you can kind of work on trying to find executive buy-in from the ground up. You have it, you don't really have it, and how do you move forward from there? So digging in, going back to those questions, like you have to ask those questions to your executive team. So say you come in there and they're like, yeah, I understand, but they don't quite know what to do. Go back to those questions and ask them, and that can help start lining up your strategy and your goals. And after that, you can kind of discuss on what to do and those priorities for your team and set the goals for your team. And ultimately, like, we want to be on a successful team, right? No one wants to have their question or their ability questioned, and we all want to have be happy and successful in our jobs. So after you ask those questions, I think these are the next kind of 3 things. You want to look at how do you programize your initiatives, setting up programs for what you're working on, then creating measurements for those, and for that one, is that measurement measuring the number of developers using your product, or whatever that is, you need to set that measurement up, and with that reporting, ideally, and then communication. This is a big one. So here are the 3 things, kind of these sectors that we'll go into, and where we go from there. So, program your initiatives. Segmenting your developer relations teams or your developer relation initiatives into programs is really beneficial, because you can really see clearly what that looks like. So this may look like an ambassador program, or a hackathon program, or different types of events, or maybe it's your education initiative. Either way, segment these into programs, and then you can have clear outcomes. Like for our education initiative, we want to have 10 demos done for this quarter. For our hackathon, we want to be initiative. We want to have 50 hackathons at this next year. And each one of those has a clearly defined goal, outcome, and give them an owner. Maybe give it a fun name if your company allows you to. But these things like that helps segment what you're working on. And then setting up measurements. This can look like a number of things. And so I listed out a couple of these ones here. So number of developer engagements. And this can be how many people were in your audience. So I'm giving a talk here, so I can report back oh, there's X amount of people showed up and then heard me speak. So that's how I'm going to measure my success. And maybe it's the number of visits to your blog post, or people that tuned into your stream, or came to looking at your repo, forked your repo for your demo. Maybe it's the number of SDK downloads, or number of developer accounts created, the number of active users on your developer forum, and maybe the number of people at your user group event. All these things are really, these are all measurements that we can use to say, what are we doing in developer relations, and here's how does this line up with everything else. And maybe you don't measure against all of those, but maybe it's just 2 of those, because those are really important to your company. Whether maybe it's the forum and they want to get more people involved and take them off Stack Overflow. Sorry to any Stack Overflow people that are out there. But if you want to tell them, this is our goal as a company, and we want to be in this forum, and we want to measure how many users are on there and how many active users are there. So the next thing we have is communication. I love this picture of the kid, by the way. Does anybody use Unsplash? Yeah, perfect. Very fun photos. Anyway, so communication. I think this is like the #1 problem we see across the industry. We spend so much time communicating outward to people about like, hey, here's this product, here's what I've got, here's a sticker, here's a swag, da 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 da, and we don't communicate internally. So we're out working so hard, and people are getting burnt out, getting on a plane or a train or a boat or whatever you use for your transportation, and you get out there and you're giving a talk, you're working really hard, but you're so exhausted by the time you get back, you don't communicate that internally. And that's where we have a problem, right? Because then everybody in your company is like, I don't know what they did. I mean, I think they're doing right, but you have to communicate that. And that may look different in a lot of different places. One thing I think is really cool is like doing like an internal company newsletter. Treat your company like they're your customer. Like, what did you work on this month? And here's where our advocates were. And here's what we worked on. We got people and we got this mention. Maybe they didn't see that really cool tweet that mentioned like, oh my gosh, this was so easy to set up and that was great. And like shout out to like Mary Grace for giving me this great blog post. And so highlight success stories of your developer relations team in a newsletter. Speaking at the company all hands twice a year, and insert like whatever that looks like for your company. But I think letting the company know what you're working on is really key and really important, because they may not know, and maybe they missed the email because emails, we get a lot of them. But saying like, here's what our initiatives, here's our programs, and here's where we are. That's a really like big thing, and it won't take much of your time. Doing an internal wiki to showcase your work. So wherever that lives, I think there's so many. Notion is a great one if anybody's used that one. Kind of having like, here's what our company's up to. Some of the guys up here before, like they've got Atlassian if you want to work with Jira or anything of that nature. But really, like whatever your company lives, maybe that's just all in Google Drive. You have a home that shows like, here's what we're up to, here's what we're working on, and hey, like come talk to us. This one I think is a little bit different. Sitting in other department meetings. So you may be in product or marketing or engineering or wherever, but coming into like your partner department and going and saying like, hey, what are you up to? And like learning about what they're working on once a month or whatever that cadence looks like is really important. And one, they see like that you're supporting them and they're really happy that you have you there. And then also you understand more what they're up to if anything's changed and making sure your initiatives still line up with those. Doing event caps internally and externally. You do a lot of work, so coming and doing event recaps for pieces you speak at. Or maybe you help the event marketing team put something up for the internal. Do a quick recap on like why you thought it was really important for the developer community. You can do it internally so that they can see that, and you can say like, yeah, that was a waste of time, so don't do that again. And they see that. Or you can say, this was great, here's great resources, like let's go bigger next time. And all those things are really important, and again, giving that kind of recap and that feedback to your department of what you're working on. Team meetings. I think this is something fun. Having an open invitation for any department to come join your team. So it's like the very first meeting of the month, feel free to come to our developer relations team meeting. You can see like what we're up to, how we're driving things, and from that, feel free to like ask any questions. So you prep your team, obviously, to not have a full disclosure. No one's complaining about anybody. But this really gives like a nice open invite for everybody else to come and say like, oh, hey, what's the DevRel team up to? And I think it's a really nice thing to do. So ultimately, I think you have to make time for this kind of work. This is like the foundation of your department. And it's a lot of work. You have to ask questions to the executives, strategize, report, communicate. I still have a full-time job. But really, ultimately, without this, your full-time job is going to go away because your company can't see what you're working on, and they can't see those results of all those initiatives that you're working on. And I think this is important too, is that ultimately I don't think you're ever too small to start a strategy or process. A team of one can totally have a whole strategy, product, like all those things we talked about, those initiatives, measurements, and doing recaps. I think Roman from Stripe is a really good example of that. He was like a team of one for a long time. And obviously clearly had a strategy that was lining up with the company and was executing on that routinely. And also, like, if you go to 2, 3, and 4, and then people start questioning that headcount, and they're going to know what's the strategy and process. So, hot take, TLDR. I think asking what department DevRel belongs in is kind of pointless, unless you have an executive sponsor. If it's 2 to 3, then that's a discussion you can talk about. If you have a sponsor that's like the CPO, the CMO, the CTO, great. I want to know what company that is, but usually you've got one, and then it's an easy choice. And it doesn't really matter if it's marketing or engineering or product or your own. But if you need to have some kind of executive sponsor, otherwise, what are we doing? And from that one, I think asking the questions, asking those hard questions, getting those answers, setting up time, communicating, these are all really key. And from that, you can then make sure you have a successful program. And that's it. Thank you for your time.